Welcome to Settled Issues, Neglected Questions with Greg Salyer. Myth itself is a subject both broad and deep. It covers the globe and even the cosmos, and it runs throughout the history of both. It also plumbs the depths of shared culture and individual psychology, reaching past our conscious and public knowledge into the veiled sources informing each. No book, course, study, or series will exhaust the possibilities of myth. Moreover, every approach will be limited by its own presuppositions and the outcomes it desires. At the same time, myth's pervasiveness and importance require that it be understood and explored. Here we attempt to take stock of what we have learned and some questions that we were not able to ask. The word settled should probably be in quotation marks, since part of the mythos of contemporary life is that no issue is ever settled. Still, we can review the ground we have covered and map it for our own orientation. Myth is a noun. Myth is a thing, something that can be distinguished from other things and having a unique set of features. Among these are that myth is a story that becomes true when it is enacted. Not all things are stories, and not all stories are enacted. After it becomes enacted, myth can become so obviously true that it need not be stated as myth anymore, and may recede into the background even as it continues to function. In fact, when myths are restated, it is often in an encounter with another myth, which also may be a threat to the myth. Though we resisted the temptation to do so before, we can now offer anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski's labyrinthine attempt to capture myth in one paragraph. Quote, "Studied alive, myth is not an explanation and satisfaction of a scientific interest, but a narrative resurrection of a primeval reality, told in satisfaction of deep religious wants, moral cravings, social substitutions, assertions, even practical requirements. Myth fulfills in oral culture an indispensable function. It expresses, enhances, and codifies belief. It safeguards and enforces morality. It vouches for the efficiency of ritual and contains practical rules for the guidance of man. Myth is thus a vital ingredient of human civilization. It is not an idle tale, but a hard-worked, active force. It is not an intellectual explanation or an artistic imagery, but a pragmatic charter of faith and moral wisdom. These stories are to the natives a statement of a primeval, greater, and more relevant reality by which the present life, facts, and activities of mankind are determined, the knowledge of which supplies man with the motive for ritual and moral actions, as well as with indications as how to perform them." Unquote. Myth is a verb. While myth is a particle, it is also a wave or a force. It acts in the world in at least 4 ways. When we ask the big questions about who we are and why we are here, it is myth that answers us. When we ask about our place in the universe and how we move through time, it is myth that answers. When we ask how we are to live together on the planet with our own and other species, it is myth that answers. When we ask who we are and what our path is as an individual, it is, again, myth that answers. The answers vary with place and time, but these answers are the source of all our thoughts and actions. Myth, then, at its deepest level, is a story enacted, not just a story told. Myth's form is story, and the variations of form depend upon the medium. Myth is born in orality, which is to say that it is shaped by the medium of speaking, even when it appears in the medium of writing. These oral forms are one source of literate culture's apparent alienation from myth. That is, archaic expressions, repetitions, and formulas. Reductionistic approaches to myth concern themselves with the genesis of its form and understand it as an aberration. Broader and more successful approaches to understanding myth show that myth is not restricted to particular forms, exists in a variety of media, and always overflows any container that attempts to hold it. Myth is in dialogue with other ways of knowing. Myth is one way of knowing and resonates profoundly with other ways of knowing. Psychology continues to draw upon Freud and Jung's engagement with mythological material and continues to see psychological health in terms of story. The dynamic between consciousness and the unconscious is of particular concern to both myth and psychology, representing as it does the center of psychic life and reflecting, as it does, the need to bring the two into some kind of healthy relation. Religion can be seen as one of myth's most familiar expressions in the world through sacred texts, places, rituals, and community. As such, the dialogue between the two is vital and ongoing at every level. Finally, though they appear in some levels of culture as opposites, myth and science share a deep affinity with paradigms or models that generate the nature of the questions that can be asked in each context. Noted scientist and philosopher Paul Feyerabend noted in his Against Method, quote, "Science is much closer to myth than a scientific philosophy is prepared to admit. It is one of the many forms of thought that have been developed by man and not necessarily the best. It is conspicuous, noisy, impudent, but it is inherently superior only for those who have already decided in favor of a certain ideology, or who have accepted it without ever having examined its advantages and its limits." Unquote. Science has largely served as the cosmological function of myth since the Enlightenment and continues to produce explanatory frameworks for things seen and unseen, known and unknown. Myth is conveyed in film. Of all the genres and forms myth inhabits, film is perhaps the most congenial to myth. One reason for this special relationship has to do with the nature of the symbol and how it becomes both more transparent and transcendent on the screen via verisimilitude. This secondary orality gives new life to myth's roots in oral cultures, even as it exponentially expands primary orality's features and effects. Myth is conveyed in literature. It was the literature that was the vehicle for myth between primary and secondary orality, and it was in literature that non-Western cultures are able to continue and adapt their oral traditions. This adaptation takes the forms of both acculturation and resistance, as the medium and some forms of aesthetics are employed both to continue the values and perspective of the oral culture and to offer a critique of colonial culture. Leslie Marmon Silko offers a vivid example of how to engage and extend a myth in literature, especially in her novel Ceremony and her book Storyteller. No doubt many questions have emerged in the discussion so far, and perhaps many others have arisen without being asked. Here we ask and attempt to answer some of the more problematic and profound ones. What isn't myth? In short, if it's not in story form, it's probably not myth. The caveats have to do with symbols, which can contain and even generate their own stories, especially if they are images. An image of an American flag, a cross, or even a commercial logo can have a story embedded in it. If that story is live in any way, that is, if it serves one or more functions of myth, then it exists on the mythic continuum. More often than not, however, if it's not in story form, it's probably not a myth. What happens when myths fail? In the simplest form, myths fail when they no longer function as myths. Some of the myths in anthologies are on the page, but they are not being enacted in the world. In that case, they become museum pieces, artifacts from a time and place no longer available to us, thus having meaning that is no longer available to us. Myths, however, can be resurrected, as Leslie Marmon Silko does in her work, although they never died for her. How do new myths emerge? Myths may go dormant. Myths may even disappear. The stories that were alive in oral cultures and are now gone are uncountable. New myths emerge as a result of new experiences, ones that exceed the old myth's scope and functions. This supplanting process has been described most convincingly by the historian of science Thomas Kuhn in explaining the emergence of new scientific paradigms to account for anomalies. As anomalies multiply, the old paradigm begins to fail and a new one to emerge. Quote, "In science, novelty emerges only with difficulty, manifested by resistance against a background provided by expectation. Initially, only the anticipated and usual are experienced even under extreme circumstances, where anomaly is later to be observed. Further acquaintance, however, does result in awareness of something wrong, or does relate the effect to something that has gone wrong before. That awareness of anomaly opens a period in which conceptual categories are adjusted until the initially anomalous has become the anticipated. At this point, the discovery has been completed." Unquote. In his last book, The Inner Reaches of Outer Space, Metaphor as Myth and Religion, Joseph Campbell begins with a survey of the newest discoveries in scientific cosmology. Reflecting first upon the significance of the moon landing, then moving to an account of the solar system in which appears, quote, "the vision of a universe of unimaginable magnitude and inconceivable violence," unquote, Campbell then pauses to reflect upon mythology. His conclusion is much like Kuhn's. And so we must now ask, what does all this have to do with mythology? Obviously, some corrections have to be made. And with Kuhn, we might add that corrections to myth emerge only with difficulty and are manifested by resistance against a background provided by expectation. How does learning about myth help? The short answer is that understanding the forces affecting you provides a consciousness that is liberating. That answer, of course, is provided by a particular myth, one based in Western culture. Those who study myth are like the ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes, who is said to have uttered, "Give me a place to stand, and I shall move the world." Indeed, where to stand is the question that faces the mythologist, because there is no place to stand outside of myth. Still, who can doubt that Archimedes did move the world in ways that are larger and more significant than his cosmic fulcrum?